Hello and welcome to today's European SharePoint Office 365 and Azure Community webinar. My name is Shane and I'm delighted to be joined by Johan Delimon, MVP, The Collective Belgium, who will be talking to you today about how to enable telephony in Microsoft Teams with the Microsoft Phone system and direct routing. Remember to join in the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP and our hashtag is ESPC20. Don't forget to check out the Resource Center. This is updated daily with the latest blogs, ebooks, webinars, and how-to videos. Simply visit sharepointeurope.com and click the content link at the top. Also, join us for ESPC20 online from the 14th to the 15th of October 2020. See sharepointeurope.com for full details and more exciting news, such as keynotes by Jeff Teeper, Caruana Gatimu, and Scott Guthrie. After the webinar, we will have a questions and answers session. Type any questions you have for Johan in the questions window. Questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and added to the Resource Center where you'll be notified by email when it is available. And now I'm going to pass you over to our webinar presenter, Johan Delimon. Hello, Johan.
Hi, let me check. I'm sharing the right screen. I think so.
Yeah, I can see your slide, so take it away, Johan.
All right, welcome to this webinar. So welcome to enable telephony in Microsoft Teams with Microsoft Phone System and direct routing. So it is a repeat from last ESPC session, although we have some updated content, of course, because things change rapidly. So I'm Johan Delimon. I live in Belgium. I work at The Collective Consulting, where I'm a managing partner. We are focusing on Office 365. I'm mainly focusing on Microsoft UC, where, of course, Microsoft Teams is a big part now and always getting better and better. So to recap Microsoft Teams, I believe everyone by now understands what Teams is, right? It's the hub for teamwork in Microsoft 365. It brings together everything, every important facet of Office 365 into one application. So this is the application where we do meetings, we do calling, we have chats and files where we collaborate on files, working together, where we do everything we can do in Office 365. Also, we have apps and workflows. Now, of course, this session is targeted at calling specifically, so let's dive into calling. So if you look at Microsoft Teams calling, it's different from what Skype for Business did, right? Teams is a cloud-only product. Skype for Business was a on-prem solution and has also an on-prem online counterpart, where Teams is an application built from the cloud. So it's designed for the cloud. It's never been on-prem, it's always been in the cloud. So that makes it really different from what we had before, as it's really native and it scales really rapidly, as we've seen in the past months. And essentially, it's an all-in-one communication system, right? Because not only we're doing calling, we're also doing meetings, chats and files. We have persistent chat in there. We have our applications in there. So it's one big application where we have different apps inside. Now, what Microsoft also did was for people that are not using telephony in Teams, is adding the phone system, the phone system application to the Teams application. So that means that everyone now has the phone application and can call colleagues or federated partners and have contact lists that they can manage in their Teams application. So you don't need a phone license to enable this because it's enabled by default. Now, of course, it doesn't have any phone features like dialing external phone numbers because you still need a license to do that. Now, it's easy to add this dial tone essentially, which actually gives you access to those PSTN features, those telephony features. And depending on how you do this is really, really easy. So essentially you can add dial tone seamlessly because just in a few clicks, essentially you can add phone numbers to users and enable your organization for calling in Teams. So we can do this, of course, in the admin portal and through PowerShell. Now, if we're looking at calling for the cloud, we have the infrastructure needed here and the components that are important. Of course, we have Office 365, where we have Microsoft Teams. So this is called the modern workplace part. So we have Microsoft Teams, but Teams by itself doesn't really do telephony, right? It does do calling, but calling is more like federated and your colleagues, so your internal people. But then if we want to do calling in the cloud, really telephony, we have to add a phone system to our Microsoft Teams application, which means the underlying infrastructure required to do phones, phone calls, is called the PBX part. Maybe you really shouldn't call it PBX. It's a phone system because sometimes people refer to a PBX with certain type of features, and then maybe people would say like, oh, but Teams doesn't have this specific feature that we are using. Yeah, that's possible, of course, but Teams does things a little bit differently, so maybe you can do things in a new way and more optimized. But essentially, you can compare it with a PBX because it essentially is a PBX, but I would rather call it a phone system. So, but essentially, the phone system infrastructure comes from the Skype Online service, where Teams reuses that phone system to deliver those telephony features. So, and then it doesn't mean that we have the PBX, the phone system, that we already have phone numbers. No, we have to add those phone numbers. And there's two ways to do this. Like either we use Microsoft calling plans, or either we are going to use direct routing. So we do have the options. We have the flexible choices here. The Microsoft calling plans, that means that, okay, Microsoft is taking care of all the telephony, the telephone numbers, and the calling minutes. So you will be paying Microsoft for your phone numbers and calling minutes. And then on the other side, you have the direct routing option, which you can reuse your existing carriers and your existing PSTN infrastructure and connect it to Office 365 and Microsoft Teams. So you're not paying Microsoft to deliver phone numbers and calling them and calling minutes. No, it's going to be your existing carrier or maybe a new carrier. Depends on how you want to progress there. So essentially, Microsoft Phone System, either Microsoft calling plans or direct routing, provides full business calling experience for Office 365, right? On a global scale, because you can do this globally. So that means whatever country you are going to be able to use Microsoft Teams as your phone system. So there is rapid innovation in Microsoft Teams, of course, and it's really going fast. And I have another slide which highlights what Microsoft announced during Inspire last week. So there is a lot of features that have been shipped by January, and it was last year, and then shipped last quarter last year, and then futures. But I'm going to highlight some of those important ones, which, for example, consultative transfers, which is a highly requested feature. That means before we transfer a call to someone else, we are first going to call this person and ask him, can you take this call because you are the subject matter expert, for example, and I can pass you through. So direct routing health dashboard, because if you're using direct routing, then you do want to get some insight in how is the direct routing solution doing. right? We want to see some metrics. We want to see, is it healthy? Is it active? Is it alive? So we have a dashboard there. Reverse number lookup. Of course, if you get a call from someone and this number is known by you or the organization, they should rather show its name instead of phone number, because people don't remember phone numbers. They remember persons' names. So reverse number lookup would show the actual name of the user instead of phone numbers. Music on hold is also quite important, because if you put a call on hold, you do want to get music instead of some beeps or some, well, music on hold will help you there. Secondary ringer, also important, because if you're using a headset and Teams is going to call you and your headset is going to notify you that an incoming call is going on. But the problem is, if your headset is lying on the table, then you don't hear this ringer. So the ability for you to have a secondary ringer helps here, so that your desktop can still warn you there's an incoming call. We have auto-attendant updates, and it still says futures on this slide here, but now Microsoft has delivered on those features, auto-attendant updates, and certainly call queues, because there's been more updates in the call queue space. Like we have more options in the routing mechanisms that we're using. Also, presence is honored in the call queues now. And we have conferencing mode, which makes it faster to connect to call queues. When people are calling into the queue, it will be faster to pick up from the agent perspective. And I'm highlighting media bypass for direct routing as well. Although it's been shipped since a while now, Microsoft recently has shipped media bypass not only for external connections, but also for the internal side of the gateway, which means now you can actually more flexibly set up direct routing for teams in your organization, because you can take care of multiple locations. You can decide what gateway it needs to be on, if the gateway essentially needs to have a public IP or not, if it's going to be using a proxy SBC that's going to be connected to Microsoft Teams and then pass through that one. But the main idea here is that we keep the media locally as much as possible. So we have a short path going to the gateway, and we don't have to hairpin over the cloud to get our phones ringing. So Microsoft had Inspire last week, and of course we had some updates there as well. So let's go over those. So let me highlight some of those interesting ones here. We have Teams and Skype consumer interop. So from now we can use Teams to connect to our Skype consumer friends, I would say. We have now also contact center partner solutions and compliance recording partner solutions. Those are quite important, because those are usually a blocker for migrating to Teams if you're on Skype for Business voice, because those solutions didn't exist yet for Teams. Now that we see those applications coming alive, it will be easier to migrate to Teams and Teams only. So that's an interesting one. And then there's more stuff coming soon, where Microsoft is talking about branch office survivability. I didn't really talk about the details yet, but really interested in what's going to happen there. We see more pop-out windows popping up in Teams everywhere, so the calling windows will pop up as well. We have call merge, which means we can merge two separate calls into one, which is what we could do in Skype for a long time. So that's really needed as well. And then interestingly, Microsoft is looking at additional calling plan countries, which means they want to expand where Microsoft themselves are delivering voice functionality in what countries. So yeah, I don't have any details there yet, but kind of curious what countries are going to be included in those new calling plans. So talking about calling plans. So calling plans means, in this case, we are going to use Microsoft as our voice provider, our carrier, and we are going to pay Microsoft for our phone numbers and calling minutes. So that means we don't have any other carrier at this point. And well, the advantage, of course, is it's really rapid provisioning because it's integrated into the admin center. So essentially, you could say we can deliver phone numbers in minutes because we don't need any equipment. There's no infrastructure needed. You don't have to do any setup. Just have to get some numbers and apply them to users. And of course, you do need the calling plans, right? So you do need the calling plan license to apply those to the users. Of course, you can bring your existing numbers to Microsoft if you want to, and that's called number porting. So you can port your existing number to Microsoft if you want to. Then you are removing your existing carrier and moving all your numbers to Microsoft. And then for the calling plans, we have two different options here, local, long distance, and international. So we have two types of calling plans, which is one is domestic and the other one is domestic and international. So they have different price points. And of course, domestic means we can only call within the same country where you are living. And then domestic and international, you can call anywhere in the world. Of course, the prices are really different there. Now, if you look at the availability of those calling plans throughout the world, it is quite limited. There are around 10, 11 countries where you can get Microsoft calling plans, and you see them on this list here and on the map. Now, interestingly, in Australia and in Japan, they are using third-party calling plans, which means third-party carriers. But in Europe and US, Microsoft is delivering everything themselves. So this is the full list, and I have it on this slide because it may not be really visible. So this is the full list of countries currently available for Microsoft calling plans. So it's Australia, Belgium, Canada, France, Germany, Ireland, Japan, Netherlands, Spain, UK, and US, and Puerto Rico. So this is the full list. Currently, there's no other country that you can use in calling plans, but apparently there's coming more countries. So let's wait and see what countries are being added to this list. So if we are looking at Microsoft calling plans and licensing requirements, so either you need Office Microsoft 365 E5 license, because that includes everything. And everything means we need at least Microsoft Teams, and we still need Escape for Business Online Plan 2, right? That's an important part, because if we don't use the Escape for Business Online license, then you cannot use phone system. This is something legacy, because originally the phone system was designed for Escape for Business, but it's reused by Teams. We just need the license. You're still in Teams only mode, right? But you do need the Escape for Business license. And additionally, you do need the phone system license, because this gives you the PBX features, the phone system features. And then maybe you need the audio conferencing, but that's kind of a separate discussion. Just for calling, you don't really need audio conferencing license, right? But they are all included in E5. So if you have E3 or non-E5 licenses, maybe something else, you do need to add Microsoft Phone System and maybe audio conferencing. So you do need to add something if you don't have E5. That's the important part here. And then from the calling plans perspective, we have the domestic calling plan, international calling plan, and the communications credits. Communications credit is not really a plan. It's more like a bucket that you can buy, like a bucket of money, like a prepaid communication credits. And then if you run over your minutes, or for example, if you only have domestic calling plan, you can call international by using the communication credits. So that is possible, but at least you need domestic or international, domestic and international calling plan. So, but not sure if you have seen the announcement, but Microsoft is adding the Microsoft 365 domestic calling plan to the E5 license. So that means all the E5 licenses, I believe it's starting in August 1st, they will receive the Microsoft domestic calling plan for free. So essentially making the E5 even cheaper, I would say, by $5-6. So that is really interesting to see that Microsoft adding those domestic calling plan minutes to E5 license. So from an infrastructural point of view, how does that work, right? We have the customer network, we may have a legacy PBX, we have Teams users, we have Office 365, the Teams service in the cloud. So if we're using calling plans, how is that going to work? So first of all, we need an SBC gateway, but that's all managed by Microsoft, because Microsoft is delivering those phone numbers and calling minutes to us, but we don't need to host any infrastructure. So Microsoft has an SBC and a SIP trunk to PSTN, fully managed by Microsoft. We don't really have to care about that. And then we have the phone numbers because we request phone numbers from Microsoft and we own them. We kind of own them, I would say, because if you lose your licenses or you won't be paying your license anymore, and in the end, your phone numbers will probably be gone. And then you do have calling minutes because you buy licenses from Microsoft, the calling plans. You do have calling minutes available for your users. So, but you see, there's no infrastructure required. And then the Teams users will use the Teams service to do PSTN calls. So if we're looking at the pros and the cons, of course, the pros, there's no infrastructure needed. It's really simple and it's really quick to activate. So adding phone numbers is really easy. Now, there are some constraints as well. Now, of course, you need additional license if you want to use this, but it's only available in 10 countries, right? So 10/11, I'd say. So what happens when you live in another country? Then we have to use another solution. So it's not available worldwide. Now, calling plans are generally more expensive than existing carrier contracts. But I'm not sure that statement is still valid if Microsoft is adding the domestic calling plan to the E5 license. I would have to reinvestigate this a little bit, but generally they were more expensive. And of course, if you want to do integration with the existing PBX, well, there is no integration. Essentially, you're going to call your PBX users over the PSTN network, which may increase the cost of your communication. Now, we can also port numbers. And of course, we can port our existing numbers, but from the other side, if you want to move away from Microsoft, they will have to port away as well. But I'm not going to be too long on this slide. So where can I port my numbers to? Of course, it needs to be the countries where you can get the calling plans. So it needs to be the same list of countries. And porting usually takes a little bit of time. So it would be at least a few weeks and maybe even months. So let's look at numbers in Microsoft Teams. So here we have in the voice part of the Microsoft Teams Admin Center, We have phone numbers tab, where we can see these are all our phone numbers. And we can easily request them with Microsoft. We just have to say, we're going to add some numbers. And let's say, so I'm going to say, for example, this is going to be United States. I do have the option to select different types of numbers. I can have user numbers, which are subscriber numbers. These are the ones that we're going to apply to users. But then we have some other phone numbers too, because they are service numbers. So that means user number is different from service numbers, because we can apply those to, for example, call queues and auto attendance, and maybe it's a toll-free number or it's a toll number. If it's a toll-free number, then you are paying for everyone calling into that number. So you need to have communication credits to cover those costs. But of course, we're looking at user numbers here. So you say, I want user numbers and maybe a location, but there's something wrong with the search here, so it's not going to finish. But essentially, you're adding a location here and you're saying a quantity like, okay, let's say 5. Of course, I can click next here, but there's the way to actually get numbers. Now, I can still do it going through the legacy portal, which means it's still the Skype for Business Online portal, but I can still request numbers from here as well. And there you can actually see the result. So if I say user numbers, I can do exactly the same thing. So I have United States. I say, well, it doesn't really matter what I choose here. Let me just say this, 2 numbers. I say add. And then it will show me a list of numbers, right? So if you say 100 numbers, it will show you a list of 100 numbers. And then you can select what numbers that you want and you say acquire numbers. And then those numbers will be available for you. So, and that will be really, really fast. So I'm not going to commit this. So I'm not going to add numbers, but those phone numbers, for example, this one is unassigned. I can edit it. And I can assign it to a user. I don't think I have a user free now, but essentially just type the name of a user here and you select the emergency location that you have to do upfront, of course, create those emergency locations and then say apply. And then a few minutes later, this user will have this phone number configured. So this entire process only takes a few minutes, essentially. So imagine having you to do this with an existing carrier, getting new numbers and then applying those numbers to your PBX. That usually takes a longer time. Now, I do want to show you, for example, I live in Belgium and the process is a little bit different. Because for now, the process is not automated yet for Belgium. And so if I would select Belgium, and probably for the rest of the countries in Europe as well. So if you do this for Belgium, and then it says, well, to acquire numbers in Belgium, please download the new number request form. Then I have to send it to this email address. So this form, so get new phone numbers. I do have to select what country I'm in, and then it will show me this is the request form. So let me open up the English version. So essentially, you just have to fill in a few things here, like, okay, we want user numbers, we have the address, we have the text number that you have to fill in, and then the amount of numbers, let's say 100. And do we want directory listing? No, probably not. What is the organization name, domain, email address, and phone number of the person responsible? So those are just the things that you need to do. You need to send it to that email address, but it's really handled quickly. It's within, I believe it's within 1 day when I did it a few times before. So it's pretty quickly, and then it's going to be added to your phone number list in the admin portal. And then the process assigning is exactly the same. So let's move into direct routing. So direct routing for Teams. So what is important here? We have, of course, Office 365 on one hand, where we have Microsoft Phone System and Teams. So all our users are connected to Teams. We have the internet, where we are connecting a session border controller. So where we host this session border controller kind of depends a little bit on how you want to deploy this, because there are some different options there. But the important thing is we need a session border controller. So at some point, or someone has to host this session border controller. Either you do it or someone else, but this session border controller is going to be there. So this is going to have a PSTN trunk to the PSTN network, so that we can have incoming calls going to the session border controller, going to Teams, and going to the user. And then outgoing calls will go this way or this route. So session border controllers, well, depending on where you implement them, you can connect them to your third-party PBX so that you really have an integration between Teams and your existing PBX. Now, you can also add analog hardware or analog devices. Sometimes the session border controllers have analog ports, or you can have analog adapters so that you can connect those to the session border controllers as well. So essentially everything you have in your organization, like emergency phones or something, or doorbells, or you name it, all of those things can be handled by this session border controller. So essentially, we are connecting our own PSTN trunk to the PSTN network. So that means we can choose whatever carrier we want to connect to Microsoft Teams. So that's what we have as a choice. Now, this is kind of interesting because there is a way to do calling plans and direct routing at the same time, which may be interesting for some scenarios. So in this case, we have a calling plan, and then users that want to do maybe domestic or maybe also international calling, they go to the PSTN network directly through Microsoft. But then maybe to connect to a PBX phone, we have to go to the session border controller because that one is going to connect to the legacy PBX. So, but the interesting part here is that you can combine those two options, calling plans and direct routing, in for the same user. So in this case, we have national calling, which is going to be the PSTN network and through Microsoft calling plans. And then there's a +41, which means UK number. It's going to be integrated with the third-party PBX. So we are integrating with PBX in this way. So saying, okay, we can do, for example, domestic calling plans through calling plans, or domestic calls to the domestic calling plan, and all international calls to the direct routing trunk, or maybe connect to the PBX phones in here as well. So Microsoft has been working on with these SBC vendors because they have to be supported, because Teams is also doing SIP, but you need to configure it in a special way because it needs to be secure. You need to do some header manipulation. You need to be aware how Microsoft is sending those SIP first to your gateway. So there are gateways that are supported. audio codes and ribbon have been supported for a long time, but then were welcome to Cisco, Ericsson, Metaswitch, and Nokia. So essentially saying that you have a lot of choice for SBCs to use to connect to Microsoft Teams. Now, I'm not saying that all the session border controllers are going to be equal, because not all of them support all the features. Like, for example, if you want to use media bypass, then you're not able to use all of the SBC vendors. So just have to be a little bit careful there, that you select the right SBC. Now, if you look at direct routing, we have different models of doing direct routing. So the first one is essentially customer hosted, which means the customer is going to do it themselves or together with an SI, system integrator. And the session border control is going to be deployed in the network of the customer. So there's an SBC for direct routing. So essentially we have the SBC at the customer. We have the SIP trunk at the customer, so that means we are going to connect it to the carrier, existing carrier or new carrier, that's the choice. And then of course, associated with this, we have phone numbers and calling minutes. So essentially all of the telephony infrastructure and the way to handle it is handled by the customer because they own the SBC, the SIP trunk, the phone numbers, and the calling minutes. So essentially there's nothing in Teams, right? So everything from the PSTN network perspective is handled by the customer. Now there is a direct routing trunk because we need to get those numbers in Microsoft Teams at some point. So this is essentially the glue, the interconnect between this SBC and the Teams. So that means those Teams users will essentially get phone numbers from this SIP trunk and those phone numbers. So, and then potentially those users can connect to this SBC from the internal network. So they don't have to go to Teams first and then come back to the SBC. So in this scenario, we have local media bypass so that internal users can connect to the internal side of the SBC. So optimizing the media path in this scenario. And of course, additionally, this SBC is hosted at the customer side, so it can connect over the network to the legacy PBX. So in this case, also we can integrate with this legacy PBX and make sure that we are moving users between legacy PBX and Teams, but still have connectivity between the existing legacy users and Teams users. So if you look at the pros and the cons, of course, direct routing is available worldwide, so we can do this wherever we want. And big plus is that we do have interop with the legacy PBX. And then whether we want it or not, we can still use our existing carriers because sometimes those contracts go a long time. And of course, those existing numbers, we want to keep the numbers. You can keep your numbers anytime, but if you want to port them or you need to port them, it's going to take a while before they are ported. Now, the downside is, of course, you need to buy and manage the SBC, or someone has to do that for you. Of course, we need to manage those SIP trunks. Maybe we need to do troubleshooting when something goes wrong. And of course, typically this is a project because this SBC needs to be implemented in the perimeter network because it needs to have a public IP address. And then you have to work with security, networking. So it's typically going to be a project. And if you compare this to getting phone numbers from Microsoft, of course, this is not going to be as fast. Now, there is a side solution to this. It's still the same model, customer hosted, but now we're hosting this in Azure. But essentially, it's doing the same thing. The SBC is there. Now it's in Azure. It's not running on your premise. It's running in Azure. And there's going to be a SIP trunk to PSTN. And this is going to be configured with direct routing to Microsoft. And the advantage of doing this is that the Azure data center is really going to be really close to the team's data centers, or where Teams is living. So this connection is going to be super fast, and then this connection may also be really super fast. Of course, we have the phone numbers and calling minutes, but of course, we're still managing all of this from the customer perspective. So the customer is still responsible for SBC, SIP trunk, phone numbers, and calling minutes. And in this case, of course, we're not going to have local media bypass, but we're going to use the Teams service to connect to the gateway. Now, of course, this is also available worldwide. We have a good connection, network connection between SBC and the Teams service. But now the question is, can we still do legacy PBX interop? Maybe we can, but then, yeah, maybe it's going over a VPN, so maybe it's not really what we want. But we can probably do it. And then we can still use existing carrier contracts. And then the cons are, of course, we need an SBC, we need to manage the SIP trunk. It's also going to be a project. It's probably going to be faster than just the customer hosted without using Azure, but still, it's still going to be a little project. And then we have a different model. It's also direct routing. So the principle is the same, but the model is different. It says carrier hosted. So in this case, the carrier, which is going to be a PSTN provider, is going to have a session border controller in its infrastructure. So this session border controller will do, well, it's hosted by the carrier. And of course, they own the SIP trunk to PSTN. You own the phone numbers and the calling minutes. And then the direct routing SIP trunk is between the SBC of the carrier and Microsoft Teams. So essentially, you are not deploying any infrastructure. So you're just buying phone numbers and calling minutes and maybe concurrent connections, depending on what carrier. They have different pricing models. But essentially, you're not providing an infrastructure. This is totally managed by the carrier. So in this case, you're not going to do media bypass, but you're going to go directly to the Teams service, which is going to the SBC, and then to the PSTN network. And then the question is, are we able to do interop with legacy PBX? I think it depends on the carrier, but usually I would say no, because that would mean a direct network connection between the carrier and your environment. So, but the overall thing is here, we don't, or the customer doesn't own this infrastructure. It's managed by the carrier, and it's a simpler model to deploy. So it's available worldwide, of course, because it's direct routing, and those carriers are also worldwide available. And there are more and more carriers coming on. Obviously, there's no infrastructure needed. You're just paying for phone numbers and minutes and maybe concurrent connections. So I would say it's as simple as deploying a SIP trunk, because we only have to do a few minor things in the Teams service to get this up and running. Well, you can also combine multiple carriers, because maybe a certain carrier is not available in all the countries. So maybe you have to combine some carriers. And keep in mind, we can still combine calling plans with direct routing model as well. And then, yeah, the interop may be limited with the legacy PBX. So a little bit zooming in on direct routing for carrier hosted model is that, okay, there's maybe one SBC and there's one customer, but they are working with multiple customers with those same SBCs. So it's more like a shared model. So that's why it's not going to be as expensive as hosting an SBC yourself. So you can connect multiple customers to this shared SBC. Now, the way you have to do this is, because those carriers need also a secured connection, which means they need to care about certificates. It means that they need, for example, customers.adatum.biz to be like their base. And then per customer, they will have a name which is underneath this domain. So this is important. So if you want to deploy this, you need to do something on your tenant, because you cannot add an SBC if the domain is not known in your tenant. So the carrier will have customers adatum.biz, and every customer will have a separate name in here. So how it actually works is, if you want to do this, direct routing for carriers, you have to choose your carrier, prepare deployment, configure users. So choose your carrier. Yeah, of course, you will have to determine whether maybe your existing carrier can support this model or not. But maybe you need multiple carriers based on where are your locations, and then are all of those carriers available in those countries. So potentially you need to port numbers to a new carrier if your carrier does not support it. But anyway, this is the first step you need to do. And then we have to prepare direct routing for carriers. So that means we have to add this domain, like I said. I'll have some screenshots about this. So essentially it's a placeholder. And we also have to create a user, which is a dummy user, you would say, that is configured to allow this direct routing configuration. And then this last step is really simple, because we just add PSTN gateways, we configure dial plans, and we do the routing accordingly so that we route to the carrier SBCs. So registering this subdomain in customer tenant. So this is the tenant name with Groove Bank US, for example, but we need to have this SBC1 customers adatum.biz, because we need to create a gateway that has this name. So what you need to do is you need to add a new domain in your tenant. So it's going to be called SBC1 customers adatum.biz. You need to verify it. So you'll be able to verify it because you own the DNS. So we're going to validate with a text record probably. When this text record has been validated, we select what services, but you don't need to select anything here. And then it says setup complete. So now you see there's a new domain. It's not going to be used by your users. It's just going to be like the glue between direct routing configuration and teams. So now we have this. Next step we have to do is create a user, because we have to activate this subdomain, so it's going to be available to be used for direct routing configuration. So it needs to have a SIP address. So that's going to be the same as the UPN. And we are going to have to apply a license. Now, in this case, I'm applying E5. You don't really need an E5 license, but it needs, I think, at least Skype for Business Online Plan 2. Yeah, so Skype for Business Online. So the important part is here, it needs to have this UPN suffix so that we know, okay, this domain is going to be activated for Skype for Business. And then once this is configured, there are a few PowerShell commands that we need to run. So what are the PowerShell commands? And those are all the PowerShell commands. If you just have one gateway, it's going to be real simple on one location. These are all the commands, so it's not a lot of work. So the first thing you need to do is say new CS online PSTN gateway. And of course, we're going to configure this gateway because this is the name of the gateway, right? Because remember, those security certificates are important, so the names are important as well. So essentially, this is going to be the SBC, so the reference to the SBC, and of course, we have a signaling port that's going to be enabled. And then before we can actually use this SBC, we have to configure our voice part. Now, in this case, it's going to be really, really simple. We're going to create the ability for users to call unrestricted, which means they can call every number. They're not restricted in any way. They can do domestic, they can do international. So we're going to create a PSTN usage, which is going to be unrestricted. Now the PSTN usage is important because that's going to be the glue between the users and the routes. So of course, we have to create a route where we are going to use the online PSTN usage unrestricted, and we're going to say this route is going to point to the SBC. And the number pattern to match is going to be any number, right? Because we are saying unrestricted. So every number is going to be called, is going to use this route, this SBC, and this PSTN usage. So then we have to create a voice routing policy because we have to apply this to a user. So this voice routing policy is going to use as well the unrestricted PSTN users. So this is the glue between these two, right? The online voice route and the voice routing policy are glued because of we are using the unrestricted PSTN usage on both of those. So and then what we have to do is enable a user. We have to enable him with on-prem line URI because this is a manual configuration and this is the way it works. It's just called on-prem line URI. This is coming way back from Skype for Business, but essentially we're using the same attribute for Teams. We're going to apply a number and we're going to say, yes, is enterprise voice and yes, hosted voicemail. And then we are going to grant him Teams upgrade to Teams if he didn't already upgrade to Teams. And then the last part is we are going to give him a policy so that he's able to route to this gateway essentially. And so that means for every number, it's going to be unrestricted. We are going to route all the calls to this SBC. So this is everything you need to do, right? Setting up the SBC and the routing and then configuring a user. So then if you look at direct routing tab, we can see those SBCs here. So we do have a view on those because it's our tenant. We're not hosting any infrastructure. So we're not seeing the SBCs, but in the admin center, we still have the information available. So we can see TLS connectivity is active, the SIP options are healthy. So this SBC is healthy and alive and is working. It says SBC with issues. That's because this is a test tenant and we don't have a lot of calls. So the calls were successful, I can tell you. So you can see there are in the last 60 days here, you can see so many streams, inbound, outbound, you see it's active. So you have some more detailed reports here, you should dive into the actual SBC. And then we can look at some metrics, the concurrent calls, because this is important because usually we say, okay, on direct routing, we're going to have X amount of concurrent calls. So we have to take into account that if we are always close to our maximum or maybe at our maximum, then we have to maybe increase the concurrent call rates. So that's important. And then we can look at the network metrics as well. Like here we see jitter, packet loss, and latency, which are all really good in this case. If this SBC hosted somewhere and the network connection is going to be bad, this will be really visible. So we have to fix that. And then we have some network effectiveness and then the average call duration, if that's important for you. And then last part is that we have PSTN usage reports, because if we do direct routing, for example, with carriers, then we're unable to troubleshoot at the SBC side because we don't have access. So if you want to at least see something, we have to go to the PSTN usage reports and then select direct routing, which you can see here, the calls that were going on, who is calling where, and then we do have some SIP response codes in case we have to do some troubleshooting. Now, this is not going to be live troubleshooting. This is going to be reports So probably you do have to work with your carrier if something is going on. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to show the same screenshots and go to my last slide. So the intention of this session was not only to make you aware of how can you enable telephone numbers in Teams or telephony in Teams, but how can you do this without any infrastructure? So the interesting part is that you can use Microsoft calling plans, of course, limited by country, but then you can combine, or you can use direct routing exclusively if you want. But this way you can implement Teams calling globally without any infrastructure. So then I come to the end of my session. So I think we can open up for questions here.
Brilliant. Thank you, Johan, for a super presentation. Yes, we will now start the questions and answers part. And should you wish to ask a question, please type it into the questions window now. Okay, Johan, we have some questions in. First one here is, we use one tenant globally. Is it possible to have Microsoft calling plan per country?
Yes. Okay, I was a little bit confused by the question, but yes. It just depends, and let me get my, I can show it. Let me see, yes. So it kind of depends on the user configuration, and we do have to go to the admin portal. So of course you have a global tenant. Everyone has one tenant, it's usually in one location. But then you apply phone numbers based on the configuration you have on the user. So for example, this user, when we go to the licenses tab, it has location United Kingdom. If I go to another user, I know this is going to be US. So depending on the location that you put in here, so it's part of the licenses tab in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. This is the way you select what country this user essentially is in. And then it applies to this location for your calling plan. So yes, you can have one tenant and you can have people in different countries. Just select the right location and then everything will be set.
Super. Next question, can we connect to multiple PBX as every country office has its own PBX?
Yes, so direct routing is not a one-to-one relationship with Microsoft Teams. So you can have multiple direct routing trunks going into Teams. Of course, I showed you just a simple configuration model of one SBC and one direct routing trunk for the configuration. But of course, you can have here as many as you want direct routing trunks. So you can apply direct routing or different routing mechanisms for different users based on the country they are in, because you apply a different routing policy for those users, for example, in Belgium, or, well, maybe not Belgium, depends, just the country. And for another country, you use a different routing policy because you could create those multiple SBCs that have different trunks to Teams. You can combine many SBCs and you can route however you want. So it's really flexible.
Super. And the last question, what about our own existing telephone numbers? Can we transfer them to Microsoft?
Yes, so that's called porting your numbers. So that means if you want to do this, of course, porting by itself is a switch that happens at a certain point in time, right? And it will flip all your numbers from one carrier to another carrier. But it's going to be initiated by Microsoft because you have to request this at Microsoft, and they will ask you a lot of questions because you have to fill in some information about your existing contract. And then Microsoft will contact your losing carrier and agree on a migration date. So that's an overall process, but that's not something that only Microsoft does. All the carriers have to do this, and porting is something, because you own the numbers, you are able to switch from carrier to another carrier because you are the owner. So yes, you can do that. It's not going to be your decision what date is going to be, because the carriers are going to decide those are the options, and then you have to select one of those options. And sometimes it takes a while before that porting request is going to work. But remember, it's going to be a big flip, right? One day you are on the existing carrier, and then the other day you're going to be on the Microsoft. So you have to make sure that everything is configured at that point, and then all the users are going to be moved at one single point in time.
Brilliant. Well, on behalf of the ESPC community, thank you, Johan, for taking the time today to complete this webinar. We really appreciate it.
Great for having me. Thank you.
Thanks, Johan. Okay, this is the end of the webinar today. Please see sharepointeurope.com for further details on all upcoming webinars, or visit the Resource Center where you will be able to access all previous episodes. Again, a big thank you to Johan Delimon, and thank you for joining us today. Take care and goodbye.